Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, is a remote island that belongs to Chile, located in the southeastern Pacific Ocean. It marks the southeastern corner of the Polynesian Triangle, deep in Oceania. This island is most famous for its nearly 1,000 monumental statues known as Moai, created by the island's early inhabitants, the Rapa Nui people. Easter Island sits over 1,000 miles away from the nearest islands in eastern Polynesia and is about 1,400 miles from the South American coast, making it one of the most isolated inhabited places on the planet. The first settlers are thought to have arrived between 600 and 800 AD, traveling from an unknown spot in eastern Polynesia after weeks of navigating the ocean. The island was named Easter Island by European explorer Jacob Roggeveen, who first saw it on Easter Sunday in 1722. When early European visitors came to the island, they recorded local oral traditions. According to the Rapa Nui people, their first ancestor was a chief named Hotu Matua. Legend has it that he arrived with his wife and extended family in one or two large canoes. These settlers were likely Polynesians, although there's some debate about the accuracy of this story and the exact date of their arrival. Some sources suggest that the island was settled as early as 300 to 400 CE, but others argue that it might have been as late as 700 to 800 CE, based on radiocarbon dating from forest clearings. A more recent study even suggests that settlers may not have arrived until 1200 CE. The Polynesians who first settled Easter Island are believed to have come from the Marquesas Islands to the west. They brought with them important plants like bananas, taro, sugarcane, and paper mulberry, as well as animals like chickens and Polynesian rats. These settlers built a complex society on the island. Some researchers believe that they sought out this remote island because of issues with ciguatera fish poisoning in their previous homes. There's also been some speculation about a possible connection between Polynesians and South Americans. One theory is that the early settlers might have come from South America due to their incredible navigational skills. This idea is supported by the presence of the sweet potato, a South American crop that was a staple in Polynesian societies for many generations. However, recent studies suggest that the sweet potato may have reached Polynesia long before the Polynesians themselves, carried by natural dispersal. When James Cook visited Easter Island, one of his crew members, a Polynesian from Bora Bora named Hiti Hiti, was able to communicate with the Rapa Nui people, showing clear cultural ties. Some researchers believe the first settlers of Easter Island might have started their journey from places like Mangareva, Pitcairn, or Henderson Islands, which are located halfway between the Marquesas and Easter Island. Evidence like similarities in language, tools, statues, and even skulls suggests that these islands could have been stepping stones for the Polynesians on their way to Easter Island. In 1999, a voyage using reconstructed Polynesian boats made it from Mangareva to Easter Island in just over 17 days, further supporting this theory. According to oral traditions recorded by missionaries in the 1860s, Easter Island once had a strict class system. At the top of this structure was the Ariki, or High Chief, who held significant power over 9 clans and their respective chiefs. The High Chief was considered the eldest descendant through the firstborn line of the island's legendary founder, Hotu Matua. One of the most striking aspects of this culture was the creation of the massive Moai statues, which many believe were representations of deified ancestors. Most scholars think these statues were created to honor ancestors, chiefs, or other important figures, but with no written records and very little oral history preserved, it's difficult to know for sure. The islanders believed that the living and the dead had a close, mutually beneficial relationship. The dead were thought to provide for the living, granting them health, fertile land, successful harvests, and good fortune. In return, the living made offerings to help the dead find better places in the spirit world. Most of the settlements were located along the coast, and the Moai were strategically placed along the shoreline, facing inward toward the settlements. These statues stood as guardians, watching over their descendants, while their backs were turned toward the sea, the direction of the spirit world. A series of catastrophic events nearly wiped out the population of Easter Island. Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, proposed that the island's society brought about its own downfall through environmental destruction. By around 1600, he suggested that the islanders had overexploited their resources, leading to deforestation, a breakdown of their ecosystem, and eventually warfare, cannibalism, and a severe population decline. Diamond argued that the building of the Moai statues, which required large amounts of timber, contributed to this environmental collapse. With the extreme deforestation, the island's fragile ecosystem was destabilized, setting the stage for societal collapse. Archaeological records show that when the island was first settled, it was home to many tree species, some growing as tall as 15 meters, as well as 6 species of land birds. A major factor in the loss of plant life was the introduction of the Polynesian rat, which had a significant impact on the island's vegetation. Studies have shown that rats can prevent plant regeneration by eating seeds, and evidence of gnawed plant seed shells on Easter Island suggests that rats played a role in the extinction of many plant species. This theory suggests that Easter Island once supported a much larger population, which had already declined significantly before European contact. The Rapa Nui people experienced a dramatic shift in their social structure due to ecological changes. By the time Europeans first arrived in 1722, the island's population had dwindled to around 2,000 to 3,000 from a peak of around 15,000 just a century earlier. By this time, 21 species of trees and all land birds had gone extinct, likely due to a combination of overharvesting, overhunting, rat predation, and climate changes. The island had become largely deforested, with no trees taller than 3 meters. The loss of large trees meant the islanders could no longer build seaworthy boats, which severely reduced their ability to fish. Deforestation also led to erosion, which caused a sharp drop in agricultural productivity. The loss of land birds and the collapse of seabird populations further reduced food sources, leaving the islanders dependent on farming and domestic chickens for protein by the 18th century. As resources dwindled and the population grew, a group of warriors known as the Matatoa gained power, and the traditional ancestor cult began to fade. This shift led to the rise of the Birdman cult, which believed that the ancestors continued to provide for the living, but the connection to them was now through human intermediaries, rather than statues. The Birdman cult held an annual competition in which representatives from each clan, chosen by their leaders, would swim through shark-infested waters to a nearby islet called Motu Nui to retrieve the first egg of the season laid by a Manutara, sooty tern. The first competitor to return with an egg and successfully climb back up to Rongorongo would be named Birdman of the Year, giving his clan control over the island's resources for the next year. This tradition was still alive when Europeans first made contact, but it was eventually suppressed by Christian missionaries in the 1860s. When European explorers arrived in 1722 and again in 1770, they reported seeing only standing Moai statues, which were still venerated. However, by the time James Cook visited in 1774, many statues had already been toppled, a process that continued into the 1830s. By 1838, the only Moai still standing were on the slopes of Rongorongo and the statue Hoa Hakananaya at Orongo. In the span of about 60 years, the islanders had damaged much of their ancestral heritage, possibly due to intertribal warfare or a loss of faith in the protective power of their ancestors. This version of Easter Island's history is highly controversial. In contrast to Jared Diamond's theory of societal collapse due to environmental destruction, a study led by Douglas Owsley in 1994 suggests there is little archaeological evidence of such a collapse before European contact. Owsley's research, which looked at bone pathology and osteometric data from that period, found that very few fatalities could be directly linked to violence. In 2021, anthropologists Robert DiNapoli and Carl Lipo from Binghamton University conducted further research, arguing that the island's population experienced steady growth from its initial settlement until Europeans arrived in 1722. Their findings suggest the population never exceeded a few thousand people and was growing, rather than in decline, before European contact. Several scholars have critiqued Diamond's claims from collapse. Anthropologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo have presented a detailed rebuttal, addressing points such as the timeline of deforestation. They argue that, while deforestation did begin early, it coincided with population growth as the land was transformed into farmland. According to their research, the population continued to increase right up until European arrival, with a notable decline starting only between 1750 and 1800. They also emphasize that Polynesian settlement didn't necessarily lead to significant forest loss unless rats were introduced, which had a much more destructive impact on vegetation. The rat species consumed only specific plants, while others, like the native Sophora toromiro, were not as affected. Furthermore, they argue that Easter Island's naturally drier and less predictable climate made it more prone to deforestation compared to other Polynesian islands, and that population declines on the island were more likely caused by the spread of disease, slave raids, and exploitation, as described in Diamond's other book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. In other works, Hunt and Lipo have continued to challenge the ecocide hypothesis, arguing that the island has unusually low evidence of warfare compared to other Polynesian islands. Unlike other islands that show signs of fortifications and large-scale conflict, Easter Island appears to have experienced only small-scale intergroup conflicts. The supposed weapons made of obsidian, once thought to be tools of war, more closely resemble agricultural tools found on other Polynesian islands. Hunt and Lipo also highlight that skeletal evidence of violence is minimal, with only 2.5% of crania showing signs of injury, and these injuries were mostly non-lethal. This aligns with Ousley's conclusion that warfare and violence had been exaggerated in folklore. One of the most controversial aspects of Diamond's theory is the suggestion of cannibalism. Hunt and Lipo argue that no clear evidence of cannibalism has been found in the skeletal remains on Easter Island. They suggest that, rather than a pre-European collapse caused by internal factors, the island's true tragedy lies in its later history, marked by slave trading, epidemic diseases, and the exploitation of its people. This post-contact devastation has been well documented, as emphasized by ethnographer Alfred Mitreau, who detailed the genocidal impact of these events on the Rapa Nui people. Hunt and Lipo also challenged the idea that the islanders had engaged in widespread statue-toppling warfare before European contact. They point out that early European accounts describe the islanders as peaceful and docile. Furthermore, the term, the Wars of the Throwing Down of the Statues, refers to an event that didn't begin until after Europeans had made contact with the island. The oral histories and archaeological evidence seem to indicate that the toppling of the Moai was not a result of pre-contact, intertribal warfare, but something that occurred later, possibly in response to the disruptions brought by Europeans. The first European contact with Easter Island happened on April 5, 1722, appropriately Easter Sunday, when Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen arrived. He and his crew spent a week on the island, and they were struck by what they found. Roggeveen estimated that the island was home to about 2,000 to 3,000 people. One of the most remarkable things noted by his party were the tall stone figures, standing about 30 feet high, which would later be known as the Moai. The land seemed fertile, with good soil and a favorable climate, and much of the island appeared to be cultivated. However, later studies like fossil pollen analysis show that by this time, the island had already undergone significant environmental changes. For instance, the main species of trees had disappeared about 72 years earlier, around 1650, which was long before the Dutch arrived. Yet the Dutch were greeted warmly by the islanders, who came out to meet them in canoes. These people were unarmed and seemed curious and friendly toward their foreign visitors. One of the Dutch officers, Carl Friedrich Barends, wrote an account of the encounter. He recalled how the islanders were fascinated by the ship and everything on board. One particular man came aboard and showed a keen interest in the rigging, sails, and even the cannons, marveling at the construction of the vessel. Barends recounted how this man reacted with astonishment when shown his reflection in a mirror, as if seeing such an image for the first time. The next foreign visitors to Easter Island arrived on November 15, 1770. Two Spanish ships, San Lorenzo and Santa Rosalia, were sent by the Viceroy of Peru, Manuel de Amat. These ships were commanded by Felipe González de Ajedo, and their mission was to thoroughly survey the island. They spent 5 days on Easter Island, carefully mapping its coastline. During their time there, they claimed the island for Spain and named it Isla de San Carlos in honor of King Charles III. As part of the formalities, they erected 3 wooden crosses atop small hills on the Poic Peninsula, symbolizing their new possession. 4 years later, in mid-March 1774, the famous British explorer James Cook made his own visit to Easter Island. Cook, however, was in poor health at the time and couldn't explore the island himself, so a small group from his crew did the work. They noted that the once majestic Moai statues appeared neglected, with some having toppled over. They found no trace of the 3 crosses that the Spanish had erected during their visit. Cook's botanist described the island as a poor land, implying it was not as fertile or flourishing as once thought. Cook brought along a Tahitian interpreter who was able to understand parts of the local language, though not all of it. Beyond basic counting, the language seemed largely unintelligible to him. Cook estimated the island's population to be around 700, a stark contrast to earlier estimates. His group only saw 3 or 4 canoes, and none of them were seaworthy. While some parts of the island were cultivated with crops like bananas, sugarcane, and sweet potatoes, other areas appeared to have fallen into neglect. One of Cook's companions, Georg Forster, remarked that there were no trees on the island taller than about 10 feet. By the time Cook arrived, the islanders had started approaching foreigners more cautiously, often carrying weapons. These weapons were spears made of black flint, 6 to 8 feet long, suggesting a growing tension between the islanders and foreign visitors, which hadn't been the case during earlier encounters. On April 10, 1786, the French explorer Jean-François de Galaup-La Pérouse arrived at Easter Island. He stayed long enough to create a detailed map and estimated that about 1/10 of the island was cultivated. According to La Pérouse, the population was roughly 2,000. By the early 19th century, Easter Island had become a frequent resupply stop for sealing and whaling ships, which increasingly put the islanders in harm's way. What began as peaceful exchanges soon turned darker as these ships started forcing the islanders into labor, eventually leading to outright slave raids. An American sealing ship made one of the first recorded visits of this kind in 1805, marking the beginning of a tragic new chapter in the island's history. The 1860s brought a devastating chapter to Easter Island's already fragile history. It began with a series of tragic events that nearly wiped out its population, starting with the arrival of Peruvian slavers. In December 1862, 8 ships arrived at Easter Island with a grim purpose: to capture people to sell in Peru for forced labor. While many Pacific islands suffered under the brutal impact of these raids, Easter Island was particularly hard hit, primarily because of its proximity to the South American coast. The Peruvian slavers relentlessly abducted the island's people over the course of several months. They captured around 1,500 men and women, half of the island's entire population. The raids weren't indiscriminate either. Among the captured were the island's paramount chief, his heir, and the few who knew how to read and write the Rongorongo script. This loss was especially significant as Rongorongo was the only known form of Polynesian script, though there's ongoing debate about whether it qualifies as true writing or a form of proto-writing. Regardless, much of the island's cultural heritage was irreparably damaged with the capture of those who held knowledge of this ancient script. Once taken to Peru, the fate of these Easter Islanders was grim. Some were sold as domestic servants, while others were sent to work as manual laborers on plantations. Conditions in captivity were brutal. Food was insufficient, discipline was harsh, and medical care was essentially non-existent. Under these conditions, disease spread quickly. Tuberculosis, smallpox, and dysentery ravaged the captives, and many of the islanders succumbed to illness before they could even begin their new lives as slaves. As word of these atrocities spread, public opinion in Peru began to turn against the slavers. Newspapers published scathing editorials, while the French government and various missionary societies raised protests against the inhumane treatment of the Polynesian captives. Under increasing pressure, the Peruvian government eventually recognized that their immigration scheme was harming the country's reputation on the international stage. By 1863, the government officially banned the introduction of any more Polynesian settlers into Peru. However, by this time, the damage had been done. Most of the enslaved Easter Islanders had already died from disease or mistreatment. In the autumn of 1863, the Peruvian government finally freed the surviving islanders, but of the original 1,500 captives, only a dozen managed to return to Easter Island. Unfortunately, they carried smallpox with them, inadvertently sparking an epidemic that swept through the already diminished population. The disease devastated the island, killing so many people that in some cases the dead were left unburied because there were too few survivors to perform burial rites. By the end of the smallpox epidemic, Easter Island's population had been reduced to a mere fraction of its former size. The combined effects of the slave raids and the epidemic left the island in ruins. This dark period marked a critical moment in the island's history, one that would leave deep scars on its people, culture, and social structure for years to come. The loss of population, the erosion of leadership, and the decimation of those who had knowledge of the Rongorongo script were blows that Easter Island would never fully recover from. The introduction of Christianity to Easter Island marked a significant yet deeply tragic chapter in the island's history, occurring during a time of immense turmoil and population decline. The first Christian missionary, Eugène Hérode, arrived on the island in January 1864. Although his initial presence made little impact on the religious practices of the island's inhabitants, Hérode's journey would set the stage for the eventual conversion of nearly the entire Rapa Nui population to Roman Catholicism. Hérode spent most of that year on the island, and during his time there, he made a monumental discovery. He was the first to report the existence of the Rongorongo tablets, a form of writing or proto-writing unique to the Rapa Nui. These wooden tablets, etched with enigmatic symbols, were crucial to the island's cultural heritage. However, as Hérode's missionary work advanced, the island was also experiencing the effects of diseases brought by foreign visitors. In 1866, Hérode returned to Easter Island with Father Hippolyte Roussel and was accompanied by Captain Jean-Baptiste Dutroux-Bornier, a French adventurer who would come to play a pivotal role in the island's future. By this time, the groundwork for the conversion of the Rapa Nui people had been laid, and their mass conversion to Roman Catholicism followed soon after. But this period was also marked by tragedy, as the island was hit by a tuberculosis epidemic in 1867, which Hérode himself contracted. The disease claimed a quarter of the island's population, reducing the already diminished number of inhabitants to just 930. At the same time, the island's ownership and social dynamics were changing. Jean-Baptiste Dutroux-Bornier began buying up large portions of the island's land, except for the area around Rongorongo, which was held by the Missionaries. Dutroux-Bornier's actions caused significant conflict between the remaining Rapa Nui inhabitants and the foreign settlers. He forced several hundred islanders to relocate to Tahiti to work for his financial backers, further diminishing the population. By 1871, tensions between the Missionaries and Dutroux-Bornier had reached a breaking point. Disillusioned and facing constant confrontations, the Missionaries evacuated most of the remaining Rapa Nui population to the Gambier Islands. They left behind only 171 islanders, mostly older men, who were too frail or unwilling to leave their homeland. Over the next few years, the population would continue to dwindle. By 1877, just 6 years after the mass evacuation, only 111 people remained on Easter Island, with only 36 individuals capable of reproducing. This drastic decline was the result of a perfect storm of factors: disease, slavery, forced relocations, and land acquisition by foreign settlers. In less than a decade, over 97% of the Rapa Nui population had perished or been removed. The cultural and social structures that had once defined the island were nearly wiped out, and much of the island's knowledge, including the significance and interpretation of the Rongorongo script, was lost with them. Alexander Salmon Jr. played a pivotal role in the history of Easter Island during the late 19th century. Born into a mercantile dynasty that had supported the controversial figure Jean-Baptiste Dutroux-Bornier, Salmon inherited vast holdings on the island, including a copra plantation. His mother was Tahitian, and his sister was the Queen of Tahiti, giving him significant influence in the Pacific. Salmon was not just an entrepreneur. He was deeply involved in the life of the island and its people, working to improve their conditions while simultaneously profiting from his landholdings. Salmon's involvement in the island extended far beyond simple economic interests. He became the sole employer on the island after purchasing nearly all the available land except for that owned by the Catholic mission. This gave him significant control over the island's affairs. Moreover, he was instrumental in introducing the island to the outside world, working closely with British and German archaeological expeditions. As the island's principal informant during these scientific endeavors, Salmon helped document Easterland's unique culture and history, even as it underwent significant changes. One of the major shifts during Salmon's tenure was linguistic. Old Rapa Nui began to merge with Tahitian, evolving into the modern Rapa Nui language. This linguistic transformation mirrored broader changes on the island as new myths, stories, and cultural practices emerged, blending Polynesian influences with those of Christianity. Salmon himself encouraged tourism on the island, hoping to transform its economy, but ultimately it was his sale of the island that marked the end of his direct influence over its future. On January 2, 1888, Salmon sold his Easter Island holdings to the Chilean government. This sale was part of a broader effort led by Chilean Navy Captain Policarpo Toro to incorporate the island into Chile's national territory. Toro had long been concerned about the vulnerability of the Rapa Nui people, who had suffered greatly from slave raids and disease. Seeing an opportunity to protect the island and its people from further exploitation, Toro used his personal finances and funds from the Chilean government to buy land on the island, including those controlled by Salmon. The signing of the Acuerdo de Voluntades on September 9, 1888, formalized Easter Island's annexation to Chile. This agreement, signed by Atamu Tekena, head of the Rapa Nui Council of Chiefs, ceded sovereignty over the island to Chile. However, the agreement stipulated that the Rapa Nui would retain their titles, lands, and cultural traditions, ensuring that they were integrated into Chile on equal terms. The annexation had some immediate benefits for the Rapa Nui, including the end of foreign slave raids, particularly those from Peru. Despite the formal incorporation of Easter Island into Chile, the Rapa Nui people continued to suffer under exploitative economic systems. Following Chile's annexation, the island's governance was disrupted by the Civil War of 1891, which destabilized the Chilean government's plans for colonization. In 1895, Enrique Merlet's Compañía Explotadora de Isla de Pascua obtained a concession over the entire island, creating a de facto monopoly. The company imposed harsh restrictions on the Rapa Nui, forcing them to live and work in Rongorongo, the island's only settlement, and forbidding them from freely moving or working outside this area. The company's control over the islanders was nearly total, with forced labor being a grim reality for many Rapa Nui. The few protections the islanders had came from the Chilean Navy, which provided safe conduct passes allowing them to cross the island and escape the harshest restrictions. However, these safeguards were limited, and the company continued to dominate life on Easter Island for several years. In 1903, the Williamson Balfour Company, an English sheep farming corporation, purchased the rights to the island from Merlet's company. Under their control, the situation for the Rapa Nui worsened. The island's resources were diverted entirely towards sheep farming, leaving the Rapa Nui with no land to cultivate their food. As a result, the islanders became dependent on the sheep ranches for their livelihoods, forced to work in order to earn enough money to buy food. This marked a low point in the island's history, as the Rapa Nui people were further marginalized on their own land. The early 20th century saw a series of significant changes on Easter Island, particularly regarding the struggles of the Rapa Nui people for autonomy and rights under Chilean rule. One of the pivotal moments during this time was the 1914 uprising, The rebellion was a response to the oppressive conditions imposed by the Williamson Balfour Company, which had controlled the island's lands since the early 1900s. The company, which used the island primarily for sheep farming, treated the Rapa Nui with great brutality, restricting their movement and confining them to the village of Rongorongo. Maria Angata, a deeply respected Rapa Nui woman with a strong influence through her Christian teachings, helped organize the rebellion. Along with Daniel Maria Teave, they hoped to compel the Chilean state to intervene and take direct control of the island, alleviating the suffering caused by the company's exploitative practices. While the uprising was ultimately suppressed, it succeeded in drawing attention to the Rapa Nui's plight, and investigations into the company's conduct revealed the brutal and savage acts committed by its administrators. In 1916, Easter Island was formally declared a subdelegation of the Department of Valparaiso, meaning it became an official administrative part of Chile. Archbishop Rafael Edward Salas visited the island that year and took up the cause of the Rapa Nui, advocating for their complaints and demands to be addressed by the Chilean government. However, despite these efforts, the Chilean state renewed the company's lease on the island under what was known as the Provisional Temperament. This agreement distributed some land to the natives, allocated land for the Chilean administration, and established a permanent naval presence on the island. The Rapa Nui people continued to live in restricted conditions. They were largely confined to Rongorongo, and permission was required for them to leave the village for basic activities like fishing or gathering fuel. This situation persisted until 1953, when Chilean President Carlos Ibáñez del Campo canceled the Williamson Balfour Company's contract for failing to comply with its terms. The administration of the island was then transferred entirely to the Chilean Navy, which oversaw the island until the mid-1960s. During this period, the island remained largely isolated from the outside world. It was only after the construction of the Mataveri International Airport in 1965 that the Rapa Nui began to have easier access to the rest of the world. Built by the Longi Construction Company, the airport was a major project that brought in hundreds of workers, heavy machinery, and infrastructure. However, the island was not fully open to tourism and international travel until 1966, when the Pascua Law was enacted. This law, passed during the presidency of Eduardo Frei Montalva, granted Chilean citizenship to the Rapa Nui and allowed them greater freedom of movement.